Hello, thank you for joining me in what may turn out to be the first in a series based along the theme of I didn't know there was a sequel to that. And in this case, not everybody realises that there is in fact a sequel to Erich Maria Remarque's First World War classic, All Quiet on the Western Front. That sequel being The Road Back. Now, All Quiet on the Western Front, which was first published late 28, early 29, stands as one of the definitive testaments to the experience of the infantryman in World War I. While the novel wasn't without its controversies, it proved at the time and has remained a phenomenally successful work. It's been filmed twice, there's even rumours of a third go at that as I speak, and it's an obligatory work on any reading list on that subject area. Within a short time of All Quiet on the Western Front's appearance, Remarque had produced a sequel. I had no idea of this myself until I stumbled over this copy in those second-hand stalls on the South Bank. Admittedly, I was slightly puzzled to learn of it, given that the central character and the narrator of the original novel, Paul Baumer, is ultimately felled by a sniper's bullet within days of the war's end. How would this book have a sequel, and was there a need for one? Well, a hint on that might lie in the original novel's opening dedication. This book is to be neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all an adventure, for death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will simply try to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped its shells, were destroyed by the war. Remarque's words here seem to suggest as an ongoing struggle for those men who, unlike the many Paul Baumers that those 4 years claimed, lived to see the armistice and subsequently had to readjust to civilian life in the aftermath. The continuity between this and the first book lies in the fact that it centres on the remaining men of Paul Baumer's platoon. Chardon, for instance, is a familiar name. Our narrator is Ernst, a teenager whose education was cut short by the war. Birkholz depicts the remnants of the platoon who were resting up in a behind-the-lines trench in the autumn of 1918. Collectively, they're in a bit of a sorry state. Undernourished, disease-riddled, and so irretrievably accustomed to the constant presence of death that they're barely able to comprehend the rumours of an impending peace. That night they're ordered up to the front, and settling into their new position, their combat instincts are aroused by something that they're struggling to identify. This turns out to be the absolute silence, which they interpret as the much rumoured outbreak of peace. Their illusion is shattered, however, by a sudden bombardment, and the resultant casualties include Vesling, whose belly lies open like a butcher's stall. Vesling is dragged back to the casualty station where the backlog is too great, and even now in the last minutes of the war, Birkholz has to comfort a man as he dies. The next morning they are ordered to evacuate their trench. The wretchedness of this retreating army and the hopelessness that their course had come to is brought into sharp relief by an encounter with some well-scrubbed American troops. Compared to these fellows, we are a perfect band of robbers. The war has passed over us like a steamroller. The curious GIs are astonished to discover that their German counterparts' wounds are now dressed in paper bandages. Having reached their rear area, the German troops are instructed by their fiery Lieutenant Heil, to their astonishment, that they are required to elect their own representatives. Max Weil, a Jewish member of the company who is much resented by Heil, announces the news that revolution has broken out in Berlin and that the Kaiser has fled to Holland in order to avoid a civil war. Heil won't hear a word of this, and the rest of the company are incredulous at the betrayal that this represents. Soldiers' councils are now to be set up, and Heil is now required to relinquish his shoulder straps. In contrast to the firebrand that they once knew, their former lieutenant is now a shadow of himself. The old order of things has abruptly inverted. They arrive back in Germany the following evening to an underwhelming greeting from the local populace. "We smell of blood," reckons Ludwig Breyer. This is not how they'd pictured their return home after these long years. The locals thaw out a little that evening, a night in which fewer men will die than ever in the last 4 years. From there, however, their journey must continue, back to a barrack square where 32 men are overlooked by the ghosts of 500 similar who never made it that far. Lieutenant Heil is lost for words of farewell, engaging instead in a bitter war of words with Weil, who extols the value of kindness over heels brand of heroism. A train journey from here sees the former comrades gradually taking their leave of one another. A small group including Bergholz, Ludwig and Willi finding themselves confronted in town by a group of sailors who are infused with revolutionary fervour and who object to Ludwig's officer tabs. A situation that threatens to escalate into gunfire, but it's diffused somehow as fellow front veterans are forced to recognise one another. But it's indicative of a very different national mood back on the home front. Having negotiated this, Ernst, Willi and Ludwig now have to face their respective parents. You'd imagine this would be a joyful occasion, but in reality it's not like coming home from your first term at uni. All seems fine back at Ernst's until his dad asks him to recount his experiences. Stumped, he has to deflect the conversation. Ernst is fidgety. He's forgotten what it's like to sit in a chair. He can't settle, and he itches for the company of his former comrades, whom he seeks out at the earliest opportunity. It turns out that their experiences back at home have been similarly uncomfortable. The war has altered them irretrievably. Willi, for instance, acts on unthinking frontline instinct and has poached, or commandeered as he thinks of it, a cockerel from his parents' neighbour's yard. In the centre of town, a throng of similarly maladjusted servicemen amass for a march on the mayor's house, a regular occurrence which turns out is fairly easily diffused, but Ernst is momentarily reassured by the presence of his comrades. And so the painful process of readjustment begins for these brutalised men, elder than their years and largely unemployed. Their rounds of the bars lead to an ugly act of revenge against a former sergeant, but before long they're to be formally demobbed and faced with a choice of seeking out employment or resuming their education. Ernst, however, finds he can't focus at all on his old books, and he allows Ludwig an indefinite loan of them. He's obliged to attend a social event at his uncle Karl's, the famous member of his family, who was a chief paymaster during the war and resides at a villa from which Wolf, the company hound of which Ernst now has custody, is banned entry. It's an excruciating experience for Ernst. The chandeliers are as merciless as bailiffs. One can hide nothing from them. Clearly the self-conscious Ernst, with his frontline manners, is chronically out of place amongst these sleek, contemptuous snobs and war profiteers who are naturally mortified when Ernst eats a pork chop with his fingers. Ernst makes an enraged exit, relieved to be back in the company of his faithful trenched dog. Ludwig, Albert and Ernst resume their course at the Teachers' College, where they encounter an old Lieutenant Georg Rahe, along with other former comrades who exhibit various signs of trench mutilation, including the horribly disfigured Paul Rademacher, whose life will forever now be blighted from an encounter with a trenching tool. Willi appears and delivers news of various comrades whose injuries, whether mental or physical, have cut short their enjoyment of peacetime. These hard-bitten survivors do not mix well with the unreconstructed conceits of an educational system that sold them the myth of death or glory in the first place. They round on the principal when he begins to trot out his field of honour cliches. Deflated, the principal implores these former troopers to articulate what it is they want. They struggle to find the words to express it. A student council meeting is laden with desires, thoughts, ambitions in seething confusion. But for peace, are we suitable? Are we fit now for anything but soldiering? And this is the question that hangs so heavily over this narrative. A nameless collective malaise has infected many of Ernst's former comrades. We'd perhaps now classify it as PTSD. Adolf Bethke is unable to communicate with his relatives, and he's devastated to learn of what's actually an isolated incident of adultery on his wife's part. Ernst himself is haunted by dreams of the horrors of war that have changed him into a person that his own mother now struggles to recognise. Meanwhile, at the Teachers' College, the student council obtains certain concessions for the former soldiers, but they're painfully aware that for all the revolutionary rumblings, they are still up against a highly reactionary bureaucracy. Ernst finds himself back at his old desk, and the traditional roll call reveals the tragic losses that his intake year have sustained. One old schoolmate, Giesecke, now resides in an asylum, his sanity having been scrambled by a horrific incident at Fleury. A visit to Giesecke is a sobering experience. I believe we all have a touch of it, concludes Ludwig. Collectively they find themselves unable to adjust to the conditions of peacetime. Few of the men embark on a countryside foraging expedition. The locals are short on charity and they find some hard bargaining has to be entered into before an encounter with a gendarme is resolved with the employment of their combat skills. While the occasional former comrades such as Lederhoser or the aloof Cookhoff appear to be flourishing in their new situation, this is not true of the majority. Such maladjustment is brought into sharp relief by a regimental reunion, which proves to be a bitterly disappointing and divisive affair. What death could not do, life is achieving. It is driving us asunder. Ernst, meanwhile, is becoming painfully aware of the absence of affection in his life. An encounter with a former teenage infatuation proving awkward and humiliating, and a chance meeting with an old compadre who's now the doorman at a nightclub where the classy girls hang out prompts an ugly flashback to a 1917 visit to a field brothel. Dejected, he heads over to Ludwig's to find him deep in debate with Jorg, who's given up any hope on coping with civilian life and has just re-enlisted. He's impervious to Ludwig's arguments. Jorg has arrived at the conclusion that in wartime conditions they had never been more alive. The revolution has dissipated and the best Jorg can do is to head to where comradeship can still be found. Ludwig, however, still blazes with the conviction that there is only one fight, and that is the fight against the old order. Ernst gets through his exams and lands a teacher training posting in a rural setting. While his infantryman's connection with the land hasn't deserted him, he's haunted in his dreams by visions of an English captain that he'd painfully dispatched during the conflict. He feels uneasy and unworthy to be placed in a position to supposedly impart wisdom to these unspoiled children. He feels the war has tainted him too much to merit such a responsibility, and he eventually quits to rejoin his old comrades back in town. However, matters are swiftly coming to a head there. Social conflicts cause a resumation of the heel versus vile conflict, which now takes place on the wider stage of demonstrators versus state power, which culminates in Vile being gunned down. Adolf Bedke's continuing doomed attempts to retrieve his marriage result in his utter ruination as a human being, a feat which the bombs and the barbed wire never accomplished. In a disreputable drinking establishment, Albert discovers his girlfriend engaged in a tryst with a sleazy war profiteer. Unaccustomed now in dealing with his conflicts in any sort of lawful way, Albert almost instinctively reaches for his revolver with fatal results. In Albert the shy lover, there still sat Albert the soldier. In the wake of this incident, Ludwig, despondent at the ruinous state of their collective youth, locks his door and slashes his wrists. Ernst is driven into a delirious state by this series of events, which involves horrific hallucination in which he's visited by the phantoms of all his perished companions, Kaczynski and Baumer included, and of course the English captain. A traumatised and deranged Ernst eventually comes to his senses in the middle of a peaceful meadow, and in this new state of curious tranquillity seeks out Ludwig's grave, where he re-encounters Jorg Rahe. Jorg has returned disillusioned from an ill-advised flirtation with the Freikorps, in which he's been compelled to open fire on former comrades. I thought to find some remnant of comradeship there, but it was mere barbarised gang spirit. Albert's trial becomes an unruly stage upon which these inflamed former warriors confront the representatives of an order which contrived to brutalise these youths into killing machines. You should have taught us to believe again in kindliness, in order, in culture and in love. But instead you started again to falsify, to lie, to stir up more hatred and to enforce your damn laws. One of us has gone under already, and there stands the second. Jorg Rahe, meanwhile, has followed Gieseker's advice in returning to the ghastly landscape of the former battlefield to try and achieve some inner resolution there. Instead, he falls into his own private derangement amongst the ruined earth and the crosses. Here stands the lost years that have not been fulfilled, like a will-o'-the-wisp over the graves. Here the unlived life that finds no rest cries out in roaring silence to the sky. In his delirium, Jorg imagines himself leading a phantom army of the betrayed towards a reckoning with those who abused them. The epilogue finds Ernst walking in the spring air with Karl Valentin, Cazorla and Willy. From the woodlands the sound of young voices disturbs them. What they assume to be a Wanderwurgel outing turns out to be a tin pot Himmelstoss leading a bunch of inexperienced teenagers through their infantry manoeuvres. Ernst and co are horrified at it, and a confrontation ensues, the former comrades being rounded on as cowards, traitors and Bolsheviks, while Willy sends these upstarts packing with a few well-chosen words. So it begins all over again, reflects Kazurli. The incident leaves a sour taste in their mouths, but Willy, who's still in the school teaching game, resolves that he's going to try to teach his charges a better idea of what their fatherland really ought to mean. One by one the companions take their leave, and Ernst finds himself alone in his room at a small country inn. He finally feels that he's getting an idea as his true way back from life in the service of destruction. There are many things to be built and almost everything to repair. It is enough that I work to dig out again what was buried during the years of shells and machine guns. Then the dead will be silenced and the past will not pursue me anymore. It will assist me instead. Bergholz is aware that this is not going to be a breeze, but he now sees his road back as an organic force, something comparable to the rise in sap which anticipates the coming of spring. Which are optimistic words given the timing of this book's appearance, 2 years before that other notable First World War veteran came to power. Naturally, this title, along with its predecessor, went onto the Verboten list in Germany during those years. But while The Road Back didn't achieve the same worldwide standing of its predecessor, it actually did get filmed, a 1937 English language production which was directed by James Whale, and I'll post a link. It is viewable on YouTube. And while, as far as much of his audience are aware, All Quiet on the Western Front is a self-contained work with a beginning, middle and end, and functions perfectly well that way, as far as there's such a thing as a necessary sequel, this book actually does make a pretty strong case for it. And it deals with some important questions which remain topical in the wake of conflicts a century down the line from the events depicted here. Now, this is admittedly more in the realms of proper literature than I usually venture. For a habitual pulp hound, this may strike you as rather serious stuff. And my thinking, though, is that Remarque's work has become a frequent touchstone or a reference point in the world of the later war pulps, and his work is taken as an initial inspiration. It is sometimes copied wholesale, and his name is quite frequently taken in vain with regard to supposed Second World War equivalents, sometimes rather egregiously so. There is a wild divergence in quality in the area of mass market war novels. It's not for no reason that Remarque's work is still held up as something of a gold standard in that subject area.